why don't we talk about contradictions within Scripture or seeming contradictions? Are there contradictions in Scripture? Does this fit with inerrancy? Carl, why don't we give him
They're all looking at me.
Yeah.
You're the biblical guy.
I think that anybody who says that there are no passages in Scripture that are hard to understand, I think they're fooling themselves. And there do appear to be places, if you compare certain gospel accounts, that look to be the same event. One place Jesus says, take only a staff. In other places, don't take a staff. What's going on? There are uses of the Old Testament in the New that are very difficult to understand. And I'm not sure how they might relate back to the text that they come from. But these are in the minority. If all of Scripture was filled with this sort of thing, maybe I'd re-examine my view of inerrancy. But Scripture is not filled with these kinds of problems. There are those problems. Carl mentioned at the end of 2 Peter 3. There are some things difficult to understand in Paul. Tough passages. And I think some of these do appear like contradictions. But as Carl quoted Augustine this morning, where Augustine said, when I come across something that looks like a mistake, I assume either that there's a textual problem, that it hadn't been transmitted in the Greek or the Hebrew manuscripts in the way it should have been, or that the translator, in this case of the Vulgate, has gotten it wrong, or that there's a limitation with my understanding. And when you think about it, someone say, oh, Beal, you just have this presupposition that the Bible is inerrant. Well, let's take the flip side. Let's say, okay, there's a contradiction. And that's an error. Think about the confidence in that. That is an absolute error. That takes a lot of certainty. How do you know it's an error? Often, what have seemed to be errors, archaeological discoveries have been discovered, have been found, that show, no, it's not. So, I think it takes some think it takes a lot of confidence to say the Bible's inerrant. I think it takes a lot of what we might call epistemological confidence to declare something as an error. But with an atheistic interpreter, let's say here on the stage right now, we would look at these hard passages and we would agree, this is a difficulty. In the same breath, he would say error. I would say, I just keep with difficulty. I admit the difficulty. You don't want to steamroll. You don't want to harmonize if there's no harmony there. You just leave it there. I think of it as a golf green. The Bible's a golf green. Most of it's pretty smooth. But you might have some weeds here and there. I'm not going to mow over them. I'll leave them standing. And what's been interesting is a lot of evangelical students, they'll look at these problems. No solution's been offered yet. And later, maybe, if I have some time, I'd like to give one or two illustrations. And they do their dissertations on it, and they solve the problem. And why do they do that? Because no one else is solving it. Because all the liberals, they're not going to work on that problem. It's an error. We know what it is. But the evangelical's got a high view of Scripture. He says, you know what? I'm going to keep doing research on that. I'm going to keep doing research on that. I might not find the answer. But 7.5 times out of 10, they do find the answer. And I have some specific examples in mind, but I better stop.
Can you just rattle off a few, just so that people have a category for what we're talking about in mind?
If you remember the beginning of Mark, I'll read it to you here. Finally, a use of my case. Always bring my case along. People wonder why I bring my case along. In Mark, at the very beginning, Mark says, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way. Anybody know where that's from? Malachi 3:1. Excuse me. As it's written in Isaiah the prophet, behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way. Malachi 3:1. Then he continues. Verse 3, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, make ready the way of the Lord, make his path straight. Okay, finally we get Isaiah. That's from Isaiah 40. in verse 3. Some evangelicals said, well, the reason that Isaiah is put before Malachi there is because Isaiah was seen as the head of the prophets. Well, I don't know. That didn't quite wash. Some not very good harmonizations were attempted. Finally, I had a student. His name was Rick Watts. Went to Gordon Conwell, wanted to do his dissertation on Mark. He went to Cambridge. And he was doing work on Mark, and what he discovered, he worked on the use of the Old Testament in Mark. And he found that Isaiah was the dominant influence from the Old Testament in Mark. And then he began to study the use of the Old Testament in Judaism of the time. And what he found is that the early Jewish rabbis and early Jewish commentators, they would explain one text in the Old Testament by another text. And sometimes the text they had in mind that they wanted to explain, they would cite second. They would cite another text first, and then the main text. And the first text was seen as supporting and explaining the second. And what he concluded here is that the reason Isaiah is put first is because Malachi is subservient to Isaiah. There are hardly any other references to Malachi. But this is an example where Isaiah is quoted first because that's the dominant influence. That sets the tone for the whole gospel. Now, a professor by the name of Morna Hooker, who was held a big professorial chair at Cambridge at the time, was giving a paper on the use of the Old Testament in Mark, and Rick Watts, the student I'm telling you about, who was working on this passage, when he came up with his explanation of this passage, I remember in her paper that she said, Mark, it says Isaiah here, but it's Malachi. Mark had a schoolboy knowledge of the Scriptures. Typical error. And she moves on. This is what I call the fundamentalism of liberalism. They have their assured results, and they're confident in them. They don't look at it anymore. She was convinced by Watts's view, but it took a whole dissertation to do it. But it's a good example of what can happen when you have some people think outside evangelicalism, you have a high view of Scripture, you put your head in the sand. In reality, sometimes it can go the other way. When you're assured of the errors, the purported errors in Scripture, you put your head in the sand, you don't research that anymore. But those with a high view of Scripture who are not willing to steamroll forced harmonizations to prove their view on inerrancy, well, they'll keep working and doing research, and sometimes they'll find the answers. That's a good example of an overturning of an assured result of scholarship of Mark's schoolboy erroneous view of Scripture.
That's great.